Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study at Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason. I'm the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and I want to welcome you to this particular study. We're excited that you're with us. Now, if possibly you're coming along tonight or today, whenever you're watching, and this is new for you, you're new to our channel, we'd love to have you subscribe to our channel. And I want to answer why we call it 316. We call this 316 based off of 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. Reminds us that all scripture is God-breathed and it's useful for teaching, for rebuking, for correcting, for training in righteousness, in order that we might be equipped, that we are able to carry out that which God has called us to do. And so for us, we love to do a little bit of verse-by-verse study. That's always our aim in these particular studies. Sometimes we have enough context and content that we're covering that we need to paraphrase some things, but for the most part we like to go verse by verse. Now we're going to have a little bit of combination of both. In this particular study of the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 10 and chapter 11 in our study this particular week. Now, let me jump over and kind of bring us up to speed on where we've been. So we've just finished coming off of John chapter 7 and 8 and then into chapter 9 and 10. And the reason I reach back to pull those forward to us, or chapter 9, I should say, is because it is all happening within the context of one particular festival. John chapter 7 and 8 are happening during the Feast of Tabernacles, and this is a 7-day festival. We talked about this in part 4, and then we talked about it in chapter 9 with our part 5. But this is a 7-day festival that happens in Jerusalem, begins on a Sabbath, and this is in the fall season. That's going to be important for us in just a minute. For instance, in 2024, the Feast of Tabernacles occurred in the second week of October. This is a late fall festival or feast for the Jewish people. The Jewish people had 7 feasts that they would honor and recognize, 3 that required traveling to Jerusalem. The Feast of Tabernacles is the final one. Well, we talked in our last one about John chapter 9. This is coming on the tail end of the Feast of Tabernacles, the day following, which also would have been a Sabbath. And we're going to read in chapter 8 about this lady being brought for accusation, caught in adultery. We talked about that. In chapter 9, we're going to see this man who was born blind, who is healed. He's told to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and all of that has a connection with one another. Well, that rolls into our study on John chapter 10 and John chapter 11. Now, John chapter 10 is divided into 2 parts, where you have part 1, you have verses 1 through 21, and then part 2 would be verses 22 through 42. And the reason that I'm highlighting John chapter 7, 8, and 9 is because there are 2 different schools of thought, and you're going to see this in just a minute. School of thought number 1 is that the first section, this part 1, verses 1 through 21, is still happening on the day following Feast of Tabernacles. That just as it began, that day began with John chapter 9, where we see that portion of it, there are many that hold that John chapter 10, that first part, is also on that same day. There are others that hold it's not in October, but it's actually in December at another particular feast. I'm going to show that to you in just a second, and hopefully you're going to learn some history or be reminded of some history, and hopefully this will be helpful for you. I'll tell you, for me, if you were to say, Joel, you're a betting man, which one do you think it is? I think part 1 is not connected to chapter 9 and not on the day following the Feast of Tabernacles. I think this is happening later, but it's just my opinion, and I'll kind of show that to you. It's a loose opinion. Part 2 is for sure. Part 2 of chapter 10 is for sure happening in December. I'll show that to you. So let's get going, and we'll get to the context. So John chapter 10, Jesus is saying, he's going to reference an analogy, speaking of himself, speaking of Israel, and he is going to use the framework and the imagery of a shepherd with sheep. So let's read along. I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. So if you look at chapter 9 and the way that chapter 9 finishes, you have the man born blind. He is kicked out of the temple. Jesus is going to find him and talk to him about how he lives and, going forward. And there are going to be some Pharisees that are close by. They're going to observe this. They're going to question him, and Jesus is going to have kind of a polarizing statement. If you were to say chapter 10 rolls into that, it makes perfect sense, because the Pharisees have taken a position as though they are the ones that control the temple, as though they control who worships the Lord. Well, John chapter 10, this imagery of shepherd and sheep fits really well off of that. I'll point to later why I think it might be more on the December side, but it would fit very well there. But let's just zero in on the shepherd and the sheep. So I'm going to just put some imagery here. These are both from Israel. As you know, or possibly know, we've had the privilege of leading 2 particular trips from our church to Israel, taking teams of people. And as you're driving along, one of the things you'll regularly see shepherds with sheep. It is a very common occupation, even to this day. If we go back into biblical times, this was very, very pronounced. So the idea of shepherd and sheep, that was just simply part of Israel's culture. And so Jesus is going to be speaking to this. Now, something about this with shepherds and sheep is you would have 2 different environments. You would have one that was called, let's say, in town, close to a city. And then you would have out in the countryside. Like I've grabbed 2 images here. One that you might be able to see town in the background up top. Shepherd would bring their sheep out into fields, but they would stay within town. And then the other one you would find in countryside. You would find just very far away in wilderness areas or in mountainous areas, shepherds with sheep. And whether they were in town or whether they were in countryside, there were different ways that you would lodge them. So let me show this to you. So in the first, you would have in town, you would have very large sheep pens. So this will, I think, make sense when we read in John 10. You would have very large sheep pen where you would have more than one flock. And a large sheep pen might have numerous flocks of sheep, where people would a shepherd would bring his flock. They would stay within this very large sheep pen, and there would be a watchman. There would be fees. There would be protecting of the sheep. And because you would have, let's just say 5 shepherds. It would be more than that, but let's say you had 5 shepherds with 5 different flocks of 100 sheep. You have 500 sheep in this analogy in one sheep pen. How do you separate them? Well, the sheep follow the voice of the shepherd. It was the way that a shepherd would lead his sheep with their voice. And it would be, you wouldn't have to say, well, that looks like mine and that looks like mine, but that doesn't look like mine. The shepherd would begin to talk when it was time to leave, and the sheep of that shepherd would follow the voice of that shepherd out of that very large pen. What you had in danger was a thief who would rightfully be coming into the sheep pen because maybe they have some sheep in there and might try and smuggle out other sheep that don't belong to him. Well, what would happen for sheep is they would only follow the voice of their shepherd. That still is true to this day. That imagery is what is being used in John chapter 10. Now keep that in mind. The other one was in the countryside, when a shepherd would be traveling in the countryside with his flock, And then the sheep pen would be very small, only the size of his particular flock, and commonly with rocks and cliff banks. And the shepherd will lay down, would bring the rocks to, let's call it a 4-foot gap, and shuttle the sheep into that 4-foot gap. And then the shepherd literally would lay down in between those rocks, and he would be the door. Sheep would not be able to jump over him, and they would not exit if the shepherd was there at the door. So the danger here certainly could be other thieves, but it could also be a predator. All of this gets pictured in John chapter 10. So let's kind of play it out. John chapter 10, verse 3. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them. If you were in the audience hearing Jesus, you know he is talking of town. Shepherds that keep their sheep close to town in this context, because you would never have watchmen out in the countryside. Keep going. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. That was how you would separate flocks for a shepherd. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they'll run away from him because they don't recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. They understood the analogy of the shepherd and sheep. That wasn't what was lost. What they didn't understand is that he is pointing all of this to him. Case one, that it's coming off a Feast of Tabernacles, and they've just kicked this man who was healed on the Sabbath out of the temple, and they think they control. Jesus is going to say, you're a thief, basically. You're not the shepherd of people. So it fits in that context. But they didn't understand that. Then, without missing a beat, he switches to what would be countryside. He says, therefore, Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, I'm the gate for the sheep. So in town, the shepherd didn't stay he wasn't the gate in town. You had a watchman, you had a gate, you separated sheep by the voice of the shepherd. Out in countryside, most definitely, the shepherd was the gate who protected the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come and go out and find pasture. Now, one of the most famous verses in the New Testament, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. And certainly we understand that that is picturing and pointing to Satan, but in its context to Jesus' delivery, certainly he's pointing at Pharisees, and certainly he's pointing to something that all the Jewish people listening would have said, we understand that parallel. And he says, I've come that they might have life and have it to the full. He's going to begin to turn everything towards himself, saying that he is the good shepherd. He is the one that watches over the sheep. And so continue to watch how this plays out. He says, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, and there's the predator, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. So you have a picture in this whole context of both in town and you have countryside, and Jesus is depicting he is the shepherd of Israel and the people that want to connect with God, which the Pharisees would have said, no, we are. We're in charge of who comes and goes. And he finishes here, the man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. He's pointing to the fact of, you care nothing for the sheep. You care nothing, follow me, you care nothing for Israel. Because it was well established and well known that God is the shepherd of his people, and that Israel was often pictured as a flock of sheep before the Lord. And he's saying, you think you guys are the shepherds, and you're not, and you don't care about the flock. But he's saying, I'm the good shepherd. In town, countryside, you could say that. Jerusalem, you could say Galilee, throughout all of Israel, I'm the good shepherd, and I lay down my life. The parallel here is so rich and so thick. So watch this. So Israel was a land full of shepherds and sheep. Number two, Israel's greatest king was David, who was a shepherd. One of Israel's greatest psalms, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And it's regarding God as the shepherd. And then also the Messiah was prophesied to be like a shepherd. So I'll give you one verse to hear. In Zechariah 10, it says, my anger burns against the shepherds, and I'll punish the leaders, for the Lord Almighty will care for his flock, the house of Judah. Now you do your Old Testament study, and you'll find that Zechariah is prophesying in this last portion of his prophecies. He is prophesying about the coming Messiah. And so it was well established that the Messiah who would come was going to be like a shepherd in the line of David. Now I'm going to push on something about David, because David was a shepherd, but David was also a warrior. That's going to come up here in just a second. So many people thought the Messiah would be both a shepherd and he would have warrior, being that he would be a strong, conquering leader. I'll lean into that in just a second. Verse 14, I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And then he says something very interesting. He says, I have sheep, other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. Now, what is he talking about there? Well, he's clearly talking about Jews and Gentiles. And when I say clearly, they wouldn't have understood it. It wasn't clear for them then. It's clear for us today, watching the fulfillment of Jesus' sacrifice, his resurrection, the church being established, but also some of the things that are written in Scripture, one specifically coming from the Apostle Paul. So, let me show you something. When you had the temple that, and we've used this drawing numerous times in these studies, when you had the temple that Jesus would have come to and taught, this is the rebuilding of the temple after the Israelites had returned post-Babylonian captivity. This is often referred to as Herod's temple because Herod refashioned it and refurbishes it over many decades. We've talked about that. This is a mock look at what the temple that Jesus would have walked in and taught within. But you see that little line called the Gentiles' courtyard. So you had what were Gentiles, people not born of Jewish descent, not followers of the covenant of God with the Jewish people. And they often are referred to as God-fearers. So when Paul writes, Paul will write about God-fearers. These are Gentiles who wanted to follow the God of the Jewish people, monotheism, not polytheism, and worshiped him outside of having circumcision. You can do your own study on it, but that would have been the categorization of God-fearers. Well, for Gentiles, where you see this depiction of this wall, that was as close to the Holy of Holies that they could get. A Gentile could go no closer. So there was a separation. Jewish people had access to proximity with the presence of God where Gentiles didn't. So watch Ephesians 2. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, that'd be Jewish people, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, foreigners to the covenants of the promise, that's going to Abraham and Moses, without hope, without God in the world, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two, being Gentile and Jew, has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. Paul is referencing something that was very tangible, very geographic. You could go into the temple area and you could see it. And he is saying the Lord in his body has divided that so that there is no longer separation, Jew versus Gentile, man versus woman. And he is depicting here back in John chapter 10, I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen, I must bring them also. they too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. And you think about sheep following voice. I hope and pray that you know the voice of the Lord, that he has called you to know him. He has called you to have fellowship with him, and that you're part of the sheep, so to say, the flock, the family of God. Now, Jesus is going to continue to point all of this towards himself, and he says, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from the Father. And what's going to happen off of that verse is there's going to be back and forth from the Jews, being conflicted about what he's talking about and whether or not he is making abstract comments or whether he's the Messiah. There's this back and forth. So follow me on this. When we pick up part 2 in verse 22, we know for a fact that we will be in verse 22, we will be in December. So let me show it to you. Here's part 2. Then came something later. Then came the Feast of Dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was in the temple area walking in Solomon's colonnade. The Jews gathered around him, saying, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Now let me lean on some things here because there's some history here that I think is helpful for us. So when it says, then came, it has the feeling from John, in my understanding, that this is the part 1 and part 2 have a connection together. And you're going to see, it's going to talk about following the voice. It's going to talk about sheep. I think there's a connection there. Some say that part 1 was connected to John 9 and would have been in October with the Feast of Tabernacles. I would hold that maybe this might be connected closer to the Feast of Dedication. Now, what is the Feast of Dedication? The Jewish people had 7 holidays. We've established that. First one is Passover. Second one is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The third one is the First Fruits, Feast of First Fruits. Then you would have Pentecost. That's where the Holy Spirit's poured out, but it points all the way back to when God gave the commandments to Moses and then gives instruction to remember and memorialize this day. Those 4 were spring feasts. People would travel to Jerusalem for Passover and Pentecost. Then you got into the fall season and you had the Feast of Trumpets, which is called Rosh Hashanah. We've heard that. It's the beginning of the year. Then you would have Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, followed by Feast of Tabernacles. So where's Feast of Dedication? It is not one of the Torah holidays. The Feast of Dedication is also often called the Feast of Lights. This is what you and I know as Hanukkah, and it happens in December every year. So let me show you this. It was called Feast of Lights, or it was called Feast of Dedication, and we understand it as as Hanukkah. That's what we're most familiar with hearing. And the story behind Hanukkah, simply if I were to put it in a very small nutshell, is you're going back to about 165 BC. And you have following Alexander the Great, and there being the division of the Greek Empire into 4 particular different quadrants and the battles that they have. And you had what would be present-day Syria, where they were called the Seleucids, and they are being led in a battle. You have Antiochus Epiphanes, who leads a battle down towards Ptolemy in Africa, and he loses. And he comes back up north through Israel into Jerusalem and ransacks Jerusalem and desecrates the temple. So when Daniel, the book of Daniel, prophesies in visions that one day there will be an abomination of desolation in Jerusalem, he is envisioning what happens in 165, but then also fulfilled in the Antichrist at a later date. But this very famous, and you can read it for yourself, Antiochus Epiphanes, and his desecration of the temple in Jerusalem. And there becomes this revolt and this fight back led by the Maccabees. They're often referred to as the Maccabees, out of the Maccabee family, the Maccabean revolt. Well, they're able to recapture Jerusalem, and in reburning of the lampstands, they had oil of just a very small capacity that should not have burned for multiple days, but they had to prepare and consecrate oil according to Mosaic custom. And there's 8 days that end up being required in this preparation of the oil. Finally, by the 8th day, they have oil that they're able to utilize. And so fast forward through the Jewish history from that point on, there was a celebration, Hanukkah, Feast of Lights, Feast of rededicating the temple. We call it Hanukkah. This is what the Feast of Dedication was. It lasts for 8 days. It was in December. So that's when it says, then came the Feast of Dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter. And they're going to ask, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Keep going with me here. Remember, David was a shepherd. David was a warrior also. So many people held that the Messiah will be like a shepherd, but he will also be a conquering warrior like David. And so people don't see Jesus creating uprising. And they're asking him, are you the Christ? Because if you're the Christ, we get the miracles, we get this parable, the parables and the teachings. But if you're in the line of David, shepherd, yes, should also be warrior, conqueror. And we're wondering if you're the Christ. Now, this is going to play out even more here in just a second for people that wanted measures of peace. I'll point to that here in just a second. It says, Jesus answered, I did tell you, but you did not believe. The miracles I do in my Father's name speak for me, but you do not believe because you're not my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them. They follow me. Pause here. You see how that connects to part 1 of John chapter 10? So either part 1 of John chapter 10 is connected to John chapter 9, and it's happening the day after Feast of Tabernacles, and then Jesus later, 2 months later, let's call it, is coming back to same kind of teaching, or somehow part 1 and part 2 are connected, and it just has the same kind of appearance of Jesus saying to the Pharisees, y'all think y'all control who comes and who goes with the kingdom of God, but you don't because you're thieves. You're not the shepherd. I'll leave it to you to kind of decide what you think. I think you would find scholars who defend both sides. But I'll keep going. He says, I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one can snatch them out of my hand. My Father has given them to me. It's greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. So what you have here, when he says, I and the Father are one, you have what is a mild reference and connection to what's called the Shema Israel, coming out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, probably the most famous Old Testament section to Jewish people and their community, where Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And they would pray this 3 times a day. It's so rooted in their culture. But the idea of I and the Father are one is a mild reference to the Shema Israel. And anytime people want to say, you know what, I don't think that Jesus really said of himself that he was God. Some people say that. They'll suggest that Jesus was a good teacher. He never said that he was truly God. And so there's debate about that. Well, 2 sides right here in John 10. He says, I and the Father are one. And this is a direct statement of divinity. And some people say, no, I don't know. Let me help you here. You can always tell in a culture, how a thing is perceived by the response of the people. So take Western understanding and just set that aside. If we take Eastern understanding and we take in Israel, how did they understand that statement? Watch. Again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. Because Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father, for which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, the miracles, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. The response of the people was to try and stone him. That was fundamentally connected to blasphemy. Fundamentally connected to, if somebody made divine claims of themselves, there were permissions to stone them. The fact that they're trying to stone him to death is a clear depiction that his words indicated that he and God were one. So from that, then we're going to go into John chapter 11, and we're going to read about the story of Lazarus. So a couple of things about Lazarus, as he lives in a town called Bethany. It's 2 miles from Jerusalem. I'm going to talk more about Bethany in our next one, because we'll find Bethany in John chapter 12. He's a brother to Mary and Martha. Jesus is about a day or two away. We know that because of how John chapter 9 finishes. And then Jesus is going to arrive. Lazarus is already going to be dead and buried, and he's going to have been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, some people will wrestle with this. I don't know. They'll say, why 4 days? Well, there was the idea in the ancient, certainly in Jewish Talmud writings, the idea that possibly the spirit would depart from trying to re-enter the body after 3 days. Whether that's accurate or not, it's certainly written and depicted. So it could have just been 4 days. It could have been to remove any of people in their culture in that time period of history of saying, well, see, the soul returned. So that's possible. But I want you to watch this. I'm going to bring this back up in verse 19. And many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. This is a part that often gets very overlooked from the Lazarus story. I don't want you to miss it. Many Jews had come. They're coming from Jerusalem. They're coming from surrounding territories, and they're coming to comfort. Just continue to remember, and many Jews had come. I'm going to come back to that. Big part of the whole John 11 story. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Now pause there. I love that statement. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. That is human emotion. That is the truth of how we feel. There are times in which we say, Lord, if you had done this, I wouldn't be experiencing that. Had you done this, that would have happened. Or had you done this, that wouldn't have happened. Lord, why? And the Lord never is going to penalize them for the human emotion. But I love the faith that gets represented here by Martha. Often people will highlight Mary because she sat at his feet, and Martha stayed busy working in another context in which they were all together. But Martha here is the one who says, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. I love that faith. I love that faith that says, had you done this, this wouldn't have happened, Lord, but I'm going to trust you right in the middle of this. Even now, even if you say something, it'll happen. And I just want to encourage you, if you're going through something, the Lord is not put off by our honest expression of how we feel about a thing, but it is very important that what we couple with that honest expression is not abandonment, is not running from Him, is not saying, well, I'm never going back to church, and I'm not going to worship, and I'm not going to believe, and I'm not going to this, and I'm mad at God. Put that aside and say, Lord, had you been here, this wouldn't have happened. But even now, you still have the final say. Martha is the one that says that, not Mary. And I hope that it would be true of you as well, that you can say, even now, Lord, whatever you say, whatever you want, whatever you're going to do, I trust you. It says that Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord." She told him, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who's come into the world." So she's making very clearly a statement that you are the Messiah, and I trust. It says in verse 28, after she had said this, she went back, called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher's here," she said. "He's asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now let me lean on that. So Martha comes out to Jesus initially. Mary doesn't. There are times that we have same pain, different expressions. So we can live with somebody, be married to somebody, be friends with somebody, experience similar pain, but have different expressions. I think we have to extend grace to one another when we express pain differently. Pain will always find an expression. Pain will always find a voice. But often it looks and comes out very different from one another, and we need to be gracious. One who moves on and one who stays back are still feeling the same pain. I've watched many people make wrong assessments or judgments of one another. You're buried in remembering. You're buried in moving forward too quickly. Well, no, same pain, different expressions. Let's be gracious to one another. From that, Mary reached the place where Jesus was, saw him. She fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She says the same thing that Martha did. Same pain, different expressions in what they did with their body. They verbalize it the same way. Watch what happens. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit. "Where have you laid him?" they asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. One of the famous statements, Jesus wept. But I love this fact that it's preceded, what comes before it, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Not just because they were crying. He loved Lazarus. I love that Jesus expresses the full emotions of his love and his relationships. That's important for us, that he is not separated from our emotions. Sometimes we can think that God is callous to us, doesn't feel what we feel. He knows exactly what we feel, and not just in a cerebral way, but also in an emotional, relational way. He feels with us. But then watch this, verse 36. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Verse 37. But some of them, remember, verse 19, many Jews had come. But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Let me just say this. Not everybody who is with you is for you. Not everybody who's around you is on page with you. So Mary and Martha are weeping because they've lost their brother, but they love Jesus and they have faith and they're expressing their personal hurt. These particular Jews who are not done from the story, you'll see that at the end of chapter 11. These Jews have accusation against Jesus. Miracles all around, but still have accusations against Jesus. And I think this is a clue to their future response on how they're going to respond to him in just a moment, even if Jesus does a miracle. I'll show that to you in just a second. Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. Now pause here. So when we took a team to Israel, we had one particular day that I and Pastor Micah, our student pastor, but way more than a student pastor. He's a family pastor. He's a pastor in our community. He is a pastor to our church. He is fantastic. He and I went away from our team. We actually went into Bethany. Bethany is Palestinian controlled. We knew we couldn't take the team in there. He and I went into Bethany because I was going to record a sermon in Bethany. And that's what we did. We recorded a sermon, sent it to our church, and they showed it that particular Sunday that we were gone. But in our time at Bethany, he and I got to go to the location that is historically known as the tomb of Lazarus. And I want to show it to you for just a second. This is just about a minute and a half clip of me. He is videoing me walking down, and obviously present day, there have been things that have been put into it, stairwell, handrail, but you would have in the ancient, you would have catacombs. they would carve out caves and carve out little pockets where tombs would be, and where, if they were the bones, those were called ossuaries, that bones would be kept in a box. But you would have little breakouts and little areas. Where I'm about to go down into is historically referred to as the place that Lazarus had been laid. I'm looking at a particular thing on the wall. You'll see in just a second. You see that light in the back? That overshadows what is a recessed hole that many scholars say this was the location, according to tradition, that Lazarus had been put into. And you can actually crawl down into this hole. And so in just a moment, I'm going to crawl down into that hole and go into what was commonly held as being the tomb, or the location that Lazarus had been laid. Jesus, from up above, outside of this cave, is going to call out, Lazarus, come forward. And we're going to read here in just a second that Lazarus comes out. Now I'm about to switch over because this is about to end here. So they come to the cave with a stone laid across the entrance. It says, take away the stone. And then watch what happens here. It says, so they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice. Lazarus came out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now, fantastic story. And that's what most people know of the Lazarus story. And it's absolutely fascinating and absolutely true. But I do want you to at least pay attention to the rest of the story. If all of that is side A, I want you to pay attention to side B. Okay? So remember John chapter 11, verse 19. It told us many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them. They had come to them to sit Shiva. That's what it's called, sitting Shiva, 7 days of weeping with somebody, and then they would return home. And we said earlier over in verse 37 that some of them had accusations against Jesus. Watch what happens. Verse 45, therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did, put their faith in him. However, not everybody. Some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Now pause. We're going to keep reading. Most people stop with Lazarus coming forward. The B side of that record is that the resurrection of Lazarus has a connection to the plan of the Sanhedrin to arrest and kill Jesus. Watch what happens. It says, then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. So the chief priests and Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin are the group of men that ruled the temple. They did not have to be Jewish men, and they did not have to be followers of faith. You had more wealth, just like purchasing in. I'm not making any political statements, but we've seen it in government where the wealthy can get in, not so much the most principled. You can get in on your monetary kind of door opening rather than your values going in. That was the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here's this man performing miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. Pause. So remember I said David. David was shepherd. David was warrior. Jewish people wanted a Messiah who was shepherd and warrior. So many say, are you the Messiah? Are you coming? Let me lean on a couple of names that you would hear in the scriptures, in the Gospels. The group of people that wanted for the Jewish people to have uprisings like the Maccabees, they were often referred to as zealots. Simon the Zealot. They believed in we've got to war, battle, fight, conflict our way into rising up. There was another group of people that said we're called to holiness and we should withdraw entirely and isolate to very remote locations. If you ever come across the name the Essenes, Essenes, the Essenes, these are the ones who do the writing in the Qumran Valley, where you and I would have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are the Essenes. If you had people that just wanted to cooperate with Rome, that was the Sanhedrin who ruled the temple. It was also, Jesus is confronted by the quote-unquote Herodians. Herodians were Jewish people who were in agreement with Herod. They were grateful for architecture and financial building up of Jerusalem. So lead how you want to lead. We're glad that we're prospering. Those were the Herodians. So you have this, what do we do when we don't have a Messiah who is ruling us and we are under the rule of Rome? Let's either fight zealots, let's retreat Essenes, or let's just get along and have peace. To the point that even if Jesus has to die, watch, then one of them named Caiaphas, you're going to hear about Caiaphas as the high priest who calls for the verdict against Jesus, who was high priest that year, spoke up, you know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that whole nation perish. If Jesus dies, we can maintain peace. If Jesus dies, then we will recapture what we think are the flock of Israel, us as the shepherds. Watch what it says. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only that for a nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. Pause. That sounds like it almost as noble. It's not. What he is depicting, what he prophesied, was that Jesus should be killed, and by the death of one will recapture the peace of all. And so it's better for all that he die. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So you have the resurrection of Lazarus and the people that watched it who returned to the Pharisees playing out into the plan and the commitment to try and arrest and kill Jesus. If you read in this, they're going to search for him. Verse 54, therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the Jews. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. And the last verses in chapter 11 say that they continued to look for Jesus. They continued to look amongst the temple for Jesus. You read those last verses. They're looking for Jesus at the temple. And when are they looking for him? Ongoing, but don't miss this. Be historical. Be very mindful of the scriptures. John chapter 7 and 9, Feast of Tabernacles. That's October. John chapter 10, 11, Feast of Dedication. That's December. John chapter 12 is the beginning of Passover. We're back all the way to the spring. They know Jesus is coming. He would come to the temple for the Passover, along with all the Jews throughout Israel coming to worship for Passover. And John chapter 12 will begin the final week of Jesus' life. And with that, we'll pick up next week in John chapter 12. And we'll see Jesus come into Bethany. We'll talk about Bethany, and we'll watch him come riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey to the heralding Hosanna in the highest. Here comes the Messiah, basically, is what they're saying. So I hope this has been a good study. I hope you've maybe learned some history, been able to connect some dots. John is fascinating. And John chapter 7 all the way to John chapter 11, you can see this ramp coming in to John chapter 12 as Jesus is going to come into Jerusalem, and there's going to be so much that John depicts. Hey, with that said, hope you read and study beyond our time together, and I hope you'll join me for John chapter 12 and 13. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.